right, welcome back everybody to episode 10 of Error Correcting Erik, where of course in every week we discuss a chapter of the book of David Deutsch, The Beginning of Infinity. Thomas has his hardcover, I have my softcover with me, and in this episode we're going to talk about chapter 10, The Dream of Socrates.
Right.
But before we do that, I want to do a quick callback to the previous episode.
Sure.
Because in that episode we had some discussions on Infinity, the Infinity Hotel, on why exactly the puppy and the trash disappears, and we were kind of struggling with that.
We were, yeah.
But in the meanwhile, so in between the recordings of this episode and the previous one, we had a discussion with a friend of yours, Bart. So shout out to Bart.
Thanks, Bart.
Who gave us this explanation, and he explained a bit on why exactly the puppy and the trash disappears in the Infinity Hotel.
Right.
And so let's do a quick recap of that before we dive into the episode. So I think we, and mainly I was struggling with the bit because if you want the trash to disappear, you need to repeat that an infinite amount of times. You need to move it up an infinite amount of times every time one floor. But in the book, it is described that they don't want people to work infinitely fast and so on, and that's where the confusion came from.
Right.
But the point is that you do actually have to move it an infinite amount of time, and that you do have to move the trash infinitely fast eventually in order to make it go up an infinite amount of time and in order to make it go disappear. So that's a bit where the confusion came from, and that's what I would like to have clarified.
All right.
Yeah, so even your friend, he calculated that, let's say that every time when you move trash, you need to walk 6 meters, and then you pick up the trash, put it in the chute, and then go back. So 6 meters of travel, and he calculated that after 26 iterations, you would already have to be moving the trash faster than the speed of light, which is of course not possible. So the idea of the trash going up and disappearing is of course a mathematical idea, just that, and it cannot exist in the physical universe similar to the Infinity Hotel. Cannot exist.
I mean, yes, but then just to add that in the book he does preface that this hotel cannot exist in our universe.
Exactly.
It is a purely simulated other universe, because, for example, when the speaker through the loudspeakers through all the rooms could never be speaking to every room at the same time in a finite amount of time.
Yeah, of course.
If it was infinitely long.
Exactly.
Because the signal of sound, even if you go against light speed, would still take time to get to, X room number X plus, whatever.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of
of course,
our universe, physical things that are happening. As you said, it's a point about the what did they call it again? The singularity, right?
Yeah.
I think more a mathematical concept of the singularity that he's trying to parochially explain through this example.
Right. Yeah. Cool. So with that clarified, let's move into chapter 10. So A Dream of Socrates. So this chapter is a little bit different. It's more of a story that I believe that David Deutsch has written himself. I don't think it's a story from somebody else that he has adopted. So in this story, it is about Socrates, of course, the famous Greek philosopher, who is sleeping in a temple in Delphi, and he has a dream. And in his dream, he meets a god, Hermes. Well, actually, he first mistakes Hermes for Apollo. He thinks he's talking to Apollo, but it's actually the Greek god Hermes. And he has a conversation with Hermes about multiple of topics that are particularly handled in the book. So as where does knowledge come from? He asks the god for knowledge and for wisdom. He asks him, what is absolute truth, and where does knowledge come from? Yeah. So Hermes, in the beginning of the conversation, says, look, I'm not going to give you any insight. I'm not going to reveal truths, nor am I going to reveal new information. But that is kind of the point, because in the conversation that they have, Socrates realizes that there's no such thing as the god revealing knowledge or revealing the truth. The god Hermes challenges Socrates in this story to think about certain things, what it could mean, and so on. And thus, Socrates, by the process of thought and ideas
and reasoning,
comes to new insights.
Right.
And that is, of course, where knowledge comes from.
Right.
So it does not come from, in this case, the God who reveals it. It does not come from reading the book of nature as we've described it before.
Right.
It comes from, and in that story, they describe it as guessing. Even when you're, for example, explaining something to me,
Right.
it's not per se that you reveal knowledge to me. I need to guess, reason what you're saying, trying to understand it, and then I can internalize the knowledge. So that's one of the core ideas of the conversation.
Right. Yeah, to me, what struck me as well was the idea of, was it Socrates being in a dream, yes or no, right? It was more like this kind of concept where he doesn't even know if he's in a dream.
Yeah,
he doesn't even know if this is going on, or if he's in real life, or if he's really a god, or if he's somebody else pretending to be the god. So he goes through all of these, kind of criticisms, right, of the conversations that he's having in his mind with somebody, right, somewhere else, but always comes to kind of, I think, the same conclusion. Regardless of what's going on, I am creating the knowledge within myself.
Yeah.
And I am the one who is critically or engaging with that knowledge. So I found it a really cool chapter because it doesn't only speak about kind of the things I think that we maybe as children kind of sometimes ponder about, where you're like, is this real? Is this a dream? And I think a lot of people, Inception style, right, with that movie, still kind of maybe think, my dream was so real, like it must have, all these, I think, superstitions also arise from that. I think the next chapter in Multiverse speaks a little bit about how those superstitions actually make sense in a multiversal sense. But that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. What struck me the most about that chapter was really the society differences, for example, between Sparta and Athens in this case, where you had the Athenian way, which was the critical, rational way, kind of maybe, let's say, the first enlightenment that occurred that we know of. And don't fact check me on this. I don't know if this is true, but at least one of the most profound impact, because basically all of civilization in the West that we know today comes from the Athenian philosophers and their way of thought, like Xenophanes, I believe his name is, as well. So anyway, we're getting a little bit lost here. My point being that the cultural differences between Sparta and Athens are not ancient. They very much we see them very much throughout our current societies as well. And I like how he used the Athens and Sparta case, because nobody feels emotional anymore about that. I think if we would bring that to a more modern context, there would be a lot of disagreements and emotions around it. But I think because of the being so far away, we can actually very objectively look at what was the difference between a Spartan society and an Athenian society. And I think a lot of the conversations that Plato has with Socrates then, who is basically the only person of which we know things about Socrates, because he famously didn't write anything down, apparently. And Plato is a bit of a special character in himself. They think that his name came from the fact that Plato means big or something, and he was a wrestler apparently. And he was a big guy, and that's kind of how he got his name, apparently. So there's a lot of and Karl Popper also writes about I think the spell of Plato in his book The Open Society and Its Enemies. Also a very amazing book for if you're critically rationally engaged, I'd say. So the Platonic worldview that comes after that was informed obviously by Plato, but then the conversations that he's having, almost as if he's looking at Socrates as this God, right? Because he thinks he's the best thinker ever. And he goes into his writing, and I think in the chapter he does that as well, right? He goes back to his book and he says, so Socrates said this and this and that, so it must be true. And then you can see Socrates frowning and going like, "Oh, student, you're not getting it." So I found that quite amusing. What was your, I guess, key takeaway then from
just to clarify a bit, so in this little story, first Socrates' dreams, where he meets the god Hermes. And indeed, he in the very beginning, he questions if it's real. But the first thing one of the first things that Hermes actually says is that it doesn't matter, if I'm actually a god speaking to you in your dream, or if it's just you dreaming about me, the end result or the process is the same.
Right.
So
his reasoning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if it's real, if it's an actual god, or if it's you say it's somebody else who was an imposter. None of that matters.
Exactly.
And then to clarify a bit about Sparta and Athens, so these were two cities in Greece, and Athens was very focused on culture, on art, on philosophy, on development of society. I also believe that like the first democracy came and from that, and things like the Senate and the way societies work and are structured, civilization as to speak.
Right.
While Sparta had a completely different philosophy.
Yeah.
They were all about, the only thing that they care about was military might. So that's where the Spartan regime and training, so they didn't have any like philosophy or art or theater or literature or poetry. Now, if it wasn't adhered to their military power, it didn't have any value. So we couldn't say that they didn't have any culture. There was a culture of militarism and discipline.
Yep.
And so there was one society that was focused, Athens, on progress, on reasoning, on developing itself.
Art.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But also in other fields like mathematics and science.
Yeah.
And one that wasn't.
Yeah.
One that was focused on just keeping the ways things were and adhering more and more to that Spartan regime. And they thought, or they believed that conquest was like the only thing they would just like defeat other cities and expand or defend themselves or whatever. And that's the only thing that mattered.
Yeah.
So to clarify a bit on that. And then, like halfway about the story, Socrates wakes up and his friends walking, like Plato and some other friends, and then they continue the conversation. So that's kind of how it works.
And then he says, "I had a dream," and then they go, "Tell me about the dream." And
exactly. And then they discuss it, and then he reflects the ideas of the things that he realized in his dream to his friends, and then Plato starts writing scribbling things down, and so on.
Yeah, that's true. It's like kind of two-part, right? Part one is the dream. Part two is him waking up and having that conversation with his, let's call them followers, I guess, right? Where he went around trying to, I guess, reason with people. But yeah, the interesting thing about that cultural change between Sparta and Athens as well, that it goes into so much tradition and culture onto the level of, I mean, obviously it has to, right? To sustain culture, you have to teach it young. So Spartan children would, from very young on be crazy, military might, and they would have physical power and all these things as like the acumen of what it is to be a good Spartan soldier, following the rules, etc. And what comes to mind with me is always like the 300, that movie with what's his name again, the actor?
Was it Russel Crowe?
No,
I'm not sure. Yeah.
No. Anyway, and I remember it was the Persian king that came as well with all of his stuff and tried to seduce the Spartans or something to with gold and all these things, and they said, "No, we're so fearless. We're gonna defeat you." Yeah. But then it goes to in the wider context, right? Because how do you sustain a culture like that? Is kind of I think a part of what he's hinting at. Because let's say there must be some kind of trade, right, that goes on between these two societies, considering their geography and their proximity to each other. There must have been some overlap. Maybe somebody defected, came over, and like Plato says, he wrestled in the book. He says this. He wrestled with some Spartans, and and he found that they had these songs, and they were quite majestic songs, and he liked that, and he's like, oh, maybe I can be a good Spartan. So it has a certain appeal, right? This sense of tradition and rigor, right? This discipline applied to I guess what is a closed society. If you'd have to go between open and closed, Sparta would be a closed one because it doesn't allow for progress, because it actually actively tries to bring progress down.
Yeah.
Because any new innovation would be seen as a threat
Exactly.
to its status quo.
Yeah.
Right. So you see this often in very like religious societies as well. You know, I think the Catholic Church, for example, back in the day, would have gone a long way to actually make sure that no innovation is done because it goes against the status quo. We see this in the Medici in Italy, in Firenze, in Florence, where you also had a mini Enlightenment that happened and was quickly shut down again by the powers that the cultural powers. So what struck me was he was kind of trying to. What I think, obviously, everything I say is my own thoughts. I can just guess at what maybe his intention, David Deutsch's intention was, but the way I'm reading it is that there's a way that he tries to speak about. Yes, there's that culture that tries to keep things static, and there's that culture that tries to, through other measures, for example, cultural, social pressures, but also physical pressures, right? You would lock people up that have different ideas, for example, right? And then you have the Athenian way, which is more progress, and by the sheer nature of the way that the society is set up, like Athens would become a shiny castle on the hill, right? Because it invests into progress, and it will therefore be more, will have more wealth, right? And I mean wealth in a Deutschian sense, not wealth in a purely kind of economical, although it is correlated, and more about that in future chapters. But so a Spartan, let's say, and I remember this, would come by and walk and get lost maybe and see the Athens, and it would be so amazed about, wow, the big castles and all the trade and the marketplaces, and maybe they have some new archery and new weaponry that is so advanced beyond what the Spartans have been able to develop, because although it is a static society, most likely still some progress iteratively is going on, right? So, I mean, maybe their slingshots have become better where they can fire longer distances, while meanwhile the Athenians can make a gun, right, versus a slingshot or a bazooka. It's that quality level of difference and progress that really does it. So it would be interesting, because if you're that Spartan and you walk by and you see what all the stuff they've got going on here in Athens, and you come back to your kind of more simple, right, yet very proud, disciplined Spartan culture, you're going to bound to have ideas about this. You're bound to kind of guess and think about that and what makes it that way, and that could spark innovation in a society that allows it to flourish.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I didn't necessarily think about it that way, but I think it's a really good view, because for me it was also a bit of a guess, like, why is this story like suddenly like in the middle of the book? It doesn't seem to be related to a lot of things, but as you describe it like that, it seems that it's highly related to the previous chapter where they talk about optimism, because there we talked about different cultures and how we can solve our problems, but it requires some level of optimism, some willingness to do reasoning and to improve and so on. And the problems that we face today are very similar to the problems that the early philosophers faced, and the early citizens of the first civilization faced. Because David Deutsch literally writes that in the book, in that chapter at some point, he says, like, the philosophical problems that these great first philosophers had, they're the same problems that we have. So there I see the link with the previous chapter on optimism.
Right. No, that's true. That's true. And in later chapters we will talk about memes as well. The memeplexes and like you have genes, you have memes, and open societies tend to have more rational memes, and closed societies tend to have more anti-rational memes. But more on that, I think, in later chapters. But indeed, the thinking hasn't changed. Humans have. I mean, similar to, let's say, the computer that we have today, right, that we're recording this on, has it has a computational algorithms in there. I don't know if that's technically a right thing to say, computational algorithms. So, bear with me. I mean, forgive me if that's technically not possible to say, but the way of computing, the way our minds compute hasn't changed since we were Homo sapiens, for example. So the thinking that they did is the same thinking that we did in a methodological sense.
Yeah.
The wiring and the firing of our neurons is roughly the same from those people to ours. It's just our problems have evolved as well.
Yeah.
Now our problems are, for example, how to get our car to the car wash.
Yeah.
While they didn't have a car wash, then they didn't have a car, then they had other things to worry about, other problems, and it's quite unique that the cultural sense in how well a society welcomes new ideas will directly impact its ability to make progress.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's also cool insight, because I didn't really gave it a lot of thought before, but that basically means that people from ancient civilizations, they had. I always thought that we as a society were more intelligent. We are maybe our brain is different, but of course that's not true. So the only difference between a human now and a human like 4,000 years ago is the knowledge that they have. But our brains operate, and the possibility of intelligence and reasoning were exactly the same.
Exactly.
But they were thinking about other problems.
Exactly.
They were thinking about how they can stack stones in a big triangle to create a pyramid.
Right.
And we're thinking about how we can send things to the moon.
Right. And a very interesting sentence that stuck me from the book is when he speaks about the Dark Ages, the European Dark Ages, where, let's say, thousands of years, literally nothing happened. Okay, maybe incremental innovations happened.
Yeah.
Again, we made a slingshot that went a meter further,
Yeah.
a castle that was a meter higher, kind of these things. Maybe the alloy of the metals where we made the swords with was slightly different compounds over time, but the amount of the cultural change, you would always expect yourself to live the same life as your grandfather did.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And now, if our society, like our grandparents, they didn't even imagine us as children, right?
Yeah.
The innovation that happened, and who knows what's going to be with my son and his children afterwards. Like the fact that you have these generational asynchronous, I guess, cultural shifts is new.
Yeah. Exactly.
We've never had that in this way. Otherwise, over time, you'd be the son of a farmer. You'd have that farm. You'd have children. You'd die. You'd have the same. It would be the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Roughly,
the society that you're born in, or your children, or your grandchildren, or the children after, very similar.
Yeah, exactly. So, when he says in the book, he says, our ancestors, they basically, and I'm paraphrasing, they basically didn't innovate, and he says we should take it personal. We should judge them and hold them accountable for not having had the courage, if you will, to have a society where, like, imagine what we did in 200 years now. That was 1,000 years that they did nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Imagine that 1,000 years was the 200 years of now was started then.
Yeah.
We'd have 1,000 years of our type of extrapolating. Who knows? We can always be a pessimist, but let's say that once the Enlightenment ways of life kick off, they just go into a progress acceleration.
Yeah.
He says we should take it seriously that our ancestors, that our ancestors didn't do that. That they were concerned with parochial things. They were concerned with, keeping their traditions as rock solidly static as possible.
Yeah.
So
also most likely we just like surviving. There was like barely enough food or to survive the winter or whatever.
Well, not necessarily, because they had quite big cities. They had quite big. I mean, if you even go back further, I think in the Roman times, I mean, the Roman Enlightenment, the Athenian Enlightenment, I think people lived up to 60, 70, 80 there as well.
Okay.
So it is not a
survival thing.
Well, it's always a survival thing.
Yeah.
But there's no reason, because we don't have more resources now than we did then.
Yeah.
We created the knowledge to convert those resources into useful things.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So that knowledge that they didn't have back then has nothing to do with quote unquote their environment.
Yeah, I see.
Right? So that there was no environmental reason for them not having been able to kick off their own enlightenment 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Okay, cool. Anything else that we would like to discuss about this chapter before we move on?
I think I said my piece here. Yeah.
Okay, cool. It's a bit of a shorter chapter. So that was chapter 10, A Dream of Socrates. Thanks again for tuning in, and join us next time where we will talk about chapter 11, where we will talk about multiverses. So looking forward to that one.
Same here.
See you.